yeah, I'll get started. So as I said, my name's Dr. Gemma Sharp, and I lead the 4M Consortium. And today I just want to talk a little bit about feminist epidemiology and the 4Ms. So the 4Ms being menarche, menstruation, menopause, and mental health. So this is an overview of my talk, and I'll keep coming back to that to guide us through. I'd like to start with some disclaimers. Why not start your whole talk with some disclaimers? I consider myself a feminist, but I'm not an expert on feminist theory. I'm not academically trained in feminist research, and I'm not even, to be honest, particularly well read or well informed. I thought that it might be useful to start by defining the definition of feminism that I'm using. So it's this definition of feminism from Bell Hooks, which is inclusive and focuses on wanting for all people to be liberated from sexist roles, domination, and oppression. And as I say, I haven't critiqued this in any kind of academic sense. This is just in line with something that I kind of personally believe. However, I am a non-lay epidemiologist, so I've been at it for a while now. Yeah, so I guess I'm about 50% qualified to give this talk. What I really like about my job is that I'm always learning. So I really hope that discussing some of these kind of work in progress ideas might help to identify and to fill the probably huge and embarrassing gaps in my knowledge. So I'll begin by discussing what epidemiology is and some of the anti-feminist biases that might exist in epidemiology. So I can do what epidemiology is. So epidemiology is the study of the distribution and determinants of health-related states. So disease, disability, death, health, well-being. And the goal is to understand the patterns and the causes of these health-related states to improve public health. So it's sometimes thought as the kind of basic science of the more applied science of public health. I think you can be an epidemiologist and never really think about what epidemiology is or why you're doing it. So it has been criticised for being a set of methods or tools that lacks a kind of theoretical framework. I think my own observation of working in epidemiology is that there's loads of really clever people doing really valuable research on and really thinking critically about the methods they're using, refining those methods, and what they're doing is really valuable. But I think that sometimes the why or the so what of epidemiology does get lost in all that kind of methodology. But the why and the so what of epidemiology are really important, and there are theories that underlie epidemiology. So this is my favourite book on epidemiology by the Harvard professor Nancy Krieger. And in this book, Krieger outlines a theoretical framework for epidemiology, and she critically discusses the field. And much of her argument stems from the observation that epidemiology has tended to focus on the biomedical and lifestyle factors, with lifestyle largely being seen as behavioural choices. And the role of the environment is acknowledged, but is often conceptualised quite loosely as anything that's not the gene or the organism. But this isn't true of all branches of epidemiology. So, for example, social epidemiology explicitly investigates the social determinants of health, or specifically the population distributions of health, and not just as a background to biological phenomena, but as important factors in their own right. And Krieger has herself developed a theoretical framework for epidemiology called eco-social theory. And this describes how there are multi-directional relationships between multi-level environments and health that change over time and manifest differently in different and intersecting social groups. So the framework incorporates constructs pertaining to our socio-political environments, so economic and political systems, institutions, and decisions that generate the conditions in which people live and work, and therefore produce health inequities. Also psychosocial factors, so individuals' perceptions or appraisals of their socially structured situations, and then how they respond psychologically, biologically, and behaviorally in a way that influences their health. And also biology, so particularly Krieger highlights the concept of embodiment, whereby we literally incorporate biologically the material and social environments in which we live. Now, Krieger's work doesn't explicitly label itself as feminist, but in this 2001 paper published in Social Science and Medicine, Marcia Inhorn and Lisa Whittle argue that it includes feminist-informed insights on epidemiological practice, and that Krieger's work provides a crucial springboard for an explicit feminist epidemiological approach, which I'll discuss more in the next section, in which I'll attempt to define what feminist epidemiology might mean. So Inhorn and Whittle make this the case for feminist epidemiology, which is explicit in its feminist critiques and feminist-informed research agendas. The feminist epidemiological approach, they argue, aims to address anti-feminist biases in mainstream epidemiology, specifically in research focusing on women's health. But what are these anti-feminist biases exactly? So firstly, Inhorn and Whittle highlight issues around the questions that epidemiology asks and how those questions are addressed. So traditionally, women's health issues have been defined by white male-dominated biomedical establishments. And so the focus has been on diseases affecting middle-aged white males, so coronary heart disease and lung cancer. They also argue that male health has been positioned as the norm and female health is different or other, sometimes with an assumption that generalizations from male-centric studies can apply universally. They argue that lay and non-elite voices are often excluded from decisions about what gets researched and how, and that women's voices are devalued and ignored. And this has led to gaps in our knowledge about health issues that predominantly affect women, which is similar to some of the discussions in this book by Caroline Criado Perez, which helped to raise the kind of public awareness of this gender data gap. And Inhorn and Whittle also argue that epidemiologists involved in women's health research may feel ill-equipped to challenge and confront ideas about the nature of epidemiological research, because we're not trained to critique theory in that way. Another anti-feminist bias in epidemiology, Inhorn and Whittle argue, is a lingering focus on biology. So biological processes are studied but are severed from the social, political, and economic determinants of health and illness. They argue that there's a biomedical and a public health focus on women as reproducers, whose health is determined by their ability to get pregnant, give birth, and adequately mother their offspring. And women are characterized by their reproductive biology, so things like their sex chromosomes and hormones, and the social realities of gender are ignored or downplayed. And women's non-reproductive health concerns and health before or after the reproductive life course are neglected. And they also argue that because women have been seen as reproducers, not producers of valued goods and services themselves, little attention has been paid to the health needs of women as workers, whether that work is paid or unpaid. And finally, Inhorn and Whittle argue that epidemiology doesn't tackle the tough why questions concerning the context in which risk factor disease relationships exist. So they argue that once a relationship between a risk factor and a disease outcome has been established or discovered, epidemiology kind of steps away without posing important questions about why risk factors occur in the first place, how they're socially distributed, and how social, political, and economic factors can generate and maintain risk in certain environments. And they also argue that epidemiologists risk the individual fallacy, whereby larger social context is ignored, and findings on sort of averages at the population level are applied at the level of the individual, which can be accompanied by victim blaming, despite it often being very challenging for an individual to reduce their risk of disease in the face of external forces. And this paper was published by, again, Nancy Krieger back in 1994. And in this, she kind of outlines the epidemiology is very interested in this kind of what she terms the web of causation. So the interconnections between different risk factors and diseases, but we're not thinking critically enough about what caused the web in the first place. So, like in her terminology, where's the spider? So Inhorn and Whittle then outline a call for the development of an emancipatory feminist epidemiology that is perceptive of and responsive to the great diversity of women, their multiple forms of oppression, and the breadth of their health needs as they themselves define them. So their approach is informed by the theorizing of Black feminists in the US, Europe, and developing countries, which are concerned with overcoming multiple interlocking simultaneous forms of oppression based on gender, race, class, nationality, and other forms of diversity. So really taking an intersectional approach and recognizing and researching the context. They also propose that feminist epidemiology builds on eco-social theory to continuously and reflexively ask how gender, race, class, nationality function on the individual, family, societal, and global levels in shaping everyday life and experiences of health. And we investigate how these factors affect everyone, including men, not just those who have been historically construed as other. They also emphasize the need for interdisciplinary collaboration in both addressing epidemiological questions as well as critiquing epidemiological approaches. So there's a quote in the paper that I liked, and I'll paraphrase it. So they say, a truly feminist informed epidemiology requires moving away from the lamppost of conventional epidemiology and confronting difficult issues around the nature of epidemiological research. And they say that epidemiologists should join forces with social science and humanities scholars who are not only more theoretically oriented, but who also value alternate qualitative forms of data that give context and meaning to epidemiologists' more quantitative analyses. So essentially, it's about being more aware of and actively working against any unfair influences that might affect epidemiological research and the decisions that we make. And then finally, they also emphasize the need to listen to and value people's experiential knowledge, so knowledge that's acquired through their own lived experiences. And they propose drawing on more participatory methods to involve communities in identifying knowledge gaps, as well as in knowledge production. So really listening to people talking about their health and defining their own health problems. So I've spoken a lot about this paper. This paper is just one paper, and it was written over 20 years ago. So how widely is feminist epidemiology being discussed and developed? So Inhorn and Whittle acknowledged that their ideas, especially around intersectionality, were informed by the work of Black feminists. More contemporary research in feminist epidemiology is also conducted by or focused on Black women or intersectionality. So, for example, there's a movement around Black feminist health science studies, which emphasizes the need to incorporate social justice into medical science, and takes a critical look at different areas like feminist health studies and medical education. This book chapter is one of the very few examples of the term feminist epidemiology being used. And there are also increasing calls for population health research to use and develop methods to enable intersectionality to be studied. And there are many more examples of feminist epidemiology in the literature. Some of them were published before and some of them after the 2001 paper by Inhorn and Whittle. I haven't done a systematic search and really I've only looked for the search terms feminist epidemiology. There's 2 papers on PubMed that use that phrasing, or feminism and epidemiology. And there are probably many other papers out there that discuss similar ideas, but maybe don't frame them using those words. I just want to briefly highlight this paper because it's the only paper that I found that used feminist epidemiology in the title, and it's quite recent. So I think the fact that it's questioning the advent of feminist epidemiology gives an indication to the paucity of the research that has kind of explicitly developed Inhorn and Whittle's ideas. But in this paper, they argue that social media can be useful for understanding the research need, so really giving people a platform for sharing their lived experience and enabling participatory research, so enabling people to connect and share ideas in supportive online spaces. And the example, or one of the examples they use, is long COVID, which mostly affects women and was initially discussed online and then emerged as a new public health topic. So that's a brief discussion of the theory, and I want to talk a little bit about some of the work that I've done that might be classed as feminist epidemiology. So I'm a biologist by training, specifically a reproductive biologist, and after my PhD, which is in Edinburgh in pregnancy health, I worked for 9 years at the MRC Integrative Epidemiology Unit in Bristol, where much of my research was related to the developmental origins of health and disease, or the DOHAD hypothesis. And this hypothesis says that our early life environment, including our prenatal environment, can affect our long-term health and risk of disease. And in particular, I was affiliated with Caroline Relton's program on epigenetic epidemiology. So I was involved in a lot of projects that used epigenetic data, specifically DNA methylation data. Now, you can argue that some of this work aligns with Krieger's ecosocial theory, because although epigenetics might sound like a very biomedical concept, actually epidemiologists tend to be interested in epigenetics as a measurable biological phenomenon that can capture both genetic variation and cumulative non-genetic or environmental exposures. And epigenetics has been described as a kind of biosocial archive, providing records of the physical and social environments that people have been exposed to, so similar to Krieger's concept of embodiment. But it should be noted, actually, that the focus has largely been on lifestyle factors or health behaviours rather than socio-political influences on health. Many of the projects that I worked on were related to the idea that epigenetic mechanisms might mediate early life and prenatal environmental effects on child and adolescent health and illness. So would provide a kind of biological mechanism through which external environmental influences during development could have persistent or latent effects on health. 10 months after I started working in epigenetic epidemiology, Sarah Richardson, who's a professor of sociology in Harvard, published this article in Nature, which urged researchers to be cautious about overstating the effect of maternal exposures during pregnancy on child health, especially in epigenetic research. And this really resonated with me, and it really got me thinking much more clearly and critically about the focus on maternal pregnancy effects and the DOHAD paradigm more broadly. So this is a slide from a presentation that I gave at the 2019 DOHAD conference in Melbourne. My intention with this slide was to highlight how DOHAD findings from population level studies can be oversimplified by scientists, press offices, the media, to suggest a deterministic causal relationship between maternal pregnancy exposures, in this case, maternal diet during pregnancy, and child health. And this can contribute to a culture of mother blame, whereby pregnant women are blamed for the ill health of the next generation. Following Sarah Richardson's commentary in Nature, I got in touch with her with some of my own concerns, and then we collaborated on a couple of papers, also with Deborah Lawler at the University of Bristol. And in this one, we showed that DOHAD research overwhelmingly focuses on the effects of maternal exposures around the time of pregnancy. So we can see the number of maternal papers that really dwarfs the number of paternal papers. But that's quite a crude way of kind of quantifying that. So subsequently, we wrote an editorial that was published in the Journal of DOHAD, in which we took a closer look. So we took every original article that had been published in the journal from when it began, and we classified the exposures studied in these papers into who was experiencing them and when. And we showed that 81% of studies considered only exposures that affected mothers. So that's that kind of yellow in a circle. 3% studied maternal exposures and paternal exposures. That's that green inner segment. And then only one study, so 0.3%, studied paternal exposures without maternal exposures. 78% of studies looked at maternal exposures in pregnancy, and 51% looked at maternal exposures in pregnancy only. So despite DOHAD's remit, including pre-pregnancy, paternal and early postnatal life exposures, over half of the articles published in the Fields Journal had focused solely on maternal pregnancy exposures. Now, you can argue that this is because there's a stronger rationale for studying mothers than fathers. They're the ones that carry the fetus. But actually, this assumption that maternal exposures are more important for child health than paternal exposures is just that. So it's an assumption, because fathers haven't been studied with anywhere near the same intensity. And we would argue that with over 2 decades of very correlative research on maternal pregnancy exposures with very little evidence of robust causal effects, there's currently no strong scientific rationale for continuing to focus research efforts on maternal pregnancy exposures so intensely. You can also argue that mothers are easier to study, so they're easier to recruit at antenatal appointments. But that argument is also challenged by the data, because we looked at animal studies where that argument doesn't hold, and we also see the same imbalance. So actually we see it more so than we did for the human studies. So we argue that the main reason for the current imbalance in DOHAD research is that it reflects an implicit, unquestioned and deeply held starting assumption that maternal pregnancy exposures are the most important causal drivers of offspring health. And in our first paper, we argued that these assumptions around this kind of causal primacy of pregnancy effects drives the DOHAD research agenda and is reinforced by a kind of looping effect that can lead to misinformed and potentially dangerous clinical practices, policies, and public perceptions about women. And we also argued that researchers need to retain a critical perspective on these assumptions, and we recommended some ways in which people might do that. And I think that some of these recommendations chime closely with some of the recommendations for feminist epidemiology suggested by Inhorn and Whittle. So firstly, collaborating with social scientists to support examination of the social implications of DOHAD research and building this into research proposals and funding. Secondly, critically appraising and monitoring the field. Thirdly, collecting better quality data on the factors that influence offspring health, including social factors, postnatal life, and paternal factors. Fourthly, improving and contextualizing the causal evidence base by scrutinizing the influence of all of those factors using causal inference techniques. And also communicating DOHAD research in a way that doesn't sensationalize or overstate the findings. So I tried to implement some of these recommendations in my next project. So in this study, the Exploring Prenatal Influences on Childhood Health, or EPOC study, we took a systematic approach to explore associations between parental prenatal health behaviours and multiple child health outcomes using data from 4 longitudinal cohort studies. So we had a maximum sample size of over 250,000 families. And crucially, we looked at both maternal and paternal prenatal effects on offspring health equally, and we applied causal inference approaches to improve the causal evidence base. And I really want to communicate these findings very transparently and accurately. So I'm building a website where visitors can explore the data themselves and generate these kind of interactive and customizable data visualizations. And that should be going live sometime in 2024. So you can definitely accuse me of reeling you in with a misleading title because we're halfway through it, and I'm going to finally get on to feminist epidemiology and the 4 M's. Earlier I mentioned that I presented our work about anti-feminist biases in Doha at the Doha conference in 2019. And that was actually a bit of a career highlight for me. So the talk was really well received. And people were standing at the back because all the seats were taken in the auditorium, and I felt like a very minor, very niche celebrity. But actually, that whole week was actually one of the worst I've ever had for my mental well-being. So I was on the other side of the world from my family and friends. I was incredibly jet-lagged. I was suffering from a particularly bad bout of social anxiety that made me not want to leave the Airbnb where I was staying. And I also had even more anxiety because the Airbnb had a cockroach infestation, and I really could not deal with that because I do not like cockroaches. I was also in the premenstrual phase of my cycle. My breasts were sore. I kept having headaches. It was a lot. So also on the day of this talk, I was having menstrual cramps, and I generally felt pretty rough. And I remember thinking it was frustrating that I could tell people that I was feeling shit because of jet lag, but it was socially inappropriate to tell people that I was also on my period, and there were kind of other things going on as well. So some people are drawn to menstrual health research because of their own very difficult experiences. Personally, I'm one of the very lucky ones who doesn't suffer too much. As far as I'm aware, my periods are normal. There's nothing pathological about them. But still, they can sometimes have an impact on my daily life and physical and mental well-being. And that's in a way that society demands that we mask or we feel shame about. So how must it be for other women, including those with menstrual disorders, or who can't afford period products, or who don't have adequate health care, who are more oppressed? I really like this quote from Inhorn and Whittle, which succinctly summarises the importance of social context and intersectionality when thinking about studying women's health. So they say, although most women share similar biological events which affect their health and well-being, women will often differ dramatically in how they experience and create meaning from these events, which is highly dependent on their social locations in space and time. So very quickly, I realised that I did indeed feel pretty ill-equipped to address research questions in this area from my limited perspective as an epidemiologist with a background in biology. And I was really keen to collaborate with others, including social scientists, to kind of broaden my perspective and learn more. Now, after my initial ponderings in 2019, we had a bit of a global crisis. And so my research activity suffered a little bit, but in 2021, I started pulling together the network of academics in the southwest of the UK, and we were funded initially by the GW4 Alliance. So initially we were called the GW4 MMHRC, but then we thankfully, I think, renamed ourselves to 4M. And then since then, we've expanded beyond the Southwest, and we currently have over 150 members in about 13 countries. And really the whole point of Forum is to share interdisciplinary perspectives and facilitate research at the intersection of menstrual and mental health, which recognises the biological, psychological, social, cultural and economic factors that shape menstrual experiences. So in line with Inhorn and Whittle's definition of feminist epidemiology, we emphasise the importance of inclusive research, considering diverse perspectives and addressing the broader sociocultural determinants that influence women's health throughout their life course. For instance, a feminist epidemiology lens recognises that the experience of menarche is not only biological, but deeply shaped by cultural, social and psychological factors. I attempted to get an overview of the current epidemiological literature on menarche by searching PubMed for menarche and epidemiology, and then downloading the titles of all the identified papers and then making a word cloud. And this is obviously a pretty crude way of doing this, but I think it does reveal some interesting trends. So currently, epidemiological research seems to be mostly concerned with the age at menarche. So what early life factors affect age at menarche? So for example, it appears that low socioeconomic position and early life adverse experiences are associated with an earlier age. And also the health consequences and correlates of an early age at menarche. So that includes breast cancer and also adolescent depression. I've seen less in the epidemiological literature about other psychosocial experiences around menarche, around cultural variations and attitudes towards menstruation and menarche, and also variations related to gender identity. So there are many research gaps there. At the other end of the reproductive life course, menopause is a normal stage of life that has historically been pathologized, emphasizing the kind of medical aspects while neglecting the broader sociocultural dimensions. And a feminist epidemiology lens calls for understanding menopause as a complex life transition influenced by cultural attitudes towards aging, gender roles, and healthcare access. According to the word cloud and what I know from my own reading, the focus in epidemiology, as with menarche, is on the age at menopause, more so than the experience of the symptoms associated with menopause. There's also a big focus on HRT and post-menopause increased risk of osteoporosis and cardiovascular disease. The core outcomes in menopause initiative, or the COMET initiative, is evaluating the extent to which different symptoms, including genitourinary symptoms and vasomotor symptoms, are considered bothersome by people experiencing menopause, which is going to help feed into kind of a more patient-led research agenda. Turning our attention to menstruation and the menstrual cycle, the big syndrome and disorders across the middle of the word cloud there probably provide some indication of the medicalization of menstruation. But this is maybe not surprising because epidemiology is a health science, and I was also looking in PubMed. But interestingly, fertility is in here, but it's very small and doesn't hold the weighting I was expecting. So the idea that menstruation is worthy of study only because it's related to fertility and women's reproductive ability doesn't appear to bear out in this data. And there's not much in here about the structural or psychosocial factors, but a feminist lens would recognise the role of the social construction of menstrual norms, disparities in menstrual health resources, and tackling taboos in shaping menstrual health and experiences. It's also probably worth noting there were relatively few papers when I searched for menstruation. So it's about 3,000 for menstruation and epidemiology compared to about 10,500 for menopause, which really highlights how little research there has been about menstruation in epidemiology. And this was all too apparent in the COVID-19 pandemic. So as a huge global crisis that brought epidemiology and public health into everyday conversations. In line with the points made in the paper about social media that I mentioned earlier, anecdotal reports about disturbed menstrual cycles during the pandemic started appearing online from the early days of the pandemic, firstly on forums like Mumsnet or Facebook or Twitter, and then being picked up by the media and reported more widely. So I noticed this, and I was interested in whether these individual accounts were part of a wider population trend, and if so, what was the mechanism? Was it a result of immune disruption caused by COVID infection and illness, something to do with the chronic stress of living through a pandemic, or perhaps behavioural, diet, or weight changes related to lockdown life? Or maybe people were just paying more attention to their health, so they noticed variations in their menstrual experiences more during this time. And this was before the widespread availability of vaccines. So but later that also became a potential culprit that people were questioning. And as with COVID infection, the likely mechanism is probably something to do with short-term but significant effects on the immune system. I spoke to my colleagues in epidemiology and got in touch with Jackie Mabin, who's a gynecologist that I'd worked in the same department as during my PhD, who put me in touch with further collaborators in anthropology in Oxford, and we conducted a systematic review of what was already out there in the scientific literature about this. So at the time in 2021, so it was actually early 2021 when we started it, and then I think we did the final search in like maybe August or something. So at the time there were very, very few studies. I think we found just 12, and the quality was very variable. So on this this risk of bias matrix, red means high risk. So you can see a lot of the studies were coming up as quite high risk. Unfortunately, most of the big well-funded COVID studies and vaccine trials didn't study menstrual features. They didn't collect data on menstrual features. At the time, this kind of blew my mind, but I'm sadly a little bit more desensitized to these kind of data gaps now. And in the paper, we made some suggestions for how future studies might reduce or mitigate against these biases. And then Alex Alverne, who was a co-author on the previous paper, led a study that implemented some of these suggestions. And this survey showed that about 20% of respondents experienced some kind of menstrual change following COVID vaccination. And COVID disease was associated with a heavier menstrual flow, but overall changes were small and appeared to be short-lived, and we think are unlikely to be related to any long-term effects on health or fertility, but large-scale longitudinal studies are needed. So I find gaps in data really frustrating. As an epidemiologist, I really like data, and I kind of rely on data to be able to do my job. When I was working on pregnancy health and VOHAD, there was no shortage of data. So longitudinal birth cohorts, like the ones that we used in the EPOC study, have collected tons of self-reported and clinically measured data on parents and their children across a broad range of domains. When I was coming up with research ideas around menstruation and menstrual health, I checked what data we had available in the cohort study that I'm most familiar with. So that's the wonderful ALSPAC study, also known as Children of the 90s, or the ABEN longitudinal study of parents and children. And I was really pleased to find that ALSPAC had collected data on cycle length, duration of bleeding, heavy menstrual bleeding, dysmenorrhea, and PMS at various time points in 2 generations of participants. Now, the data are far from perfect, but ALSPAC at least had the foresight to collect them, and the data are usable. Very recently, Gemma Sawyer, who's a PhD student working with me, published this data note in Welcome Open Research, which we really hope will facilitate epidemiological studies of menstruation using ALSPAC. As for other epidemiological studies that have collected menstrual data, there's a disappointingly small number. So I'm aware of just a handful that have any data on heavy bleeding and pain. So there's the Australian longitudinal study of women's health, the RAIN cohort, also in Australia, MOBA in Norway, ABCD in the US, and of course ALSPAC. So if anyone knows of any more cohorts, especially from different countries and contexts, then please let me know, because I think this is a really serious barrier to epidemiological research in this area. And it really, again, highlights the lack of attention that menstrual health has received in epidemiology. I'm going through the 4 M's, if you hadn't noticed that. I'm not, but actually I'm not. So I'm going to stop here with mental health, because I don't want to talk about it explicitly as an M in its own right, because it's such a broad area. And in 4M, we're really interested in the intersection between menstrual and mental health. What I will say is that much of the epidemiological research on the other 3 M's and mental health focuses on firstly, the causal relationships between early age at menarche and adolescent depression. Secondly, the impact of endometriosis or polycystic ovary syndrome on quality of life, including on mental health. Thirdly, premenstrual dysphoric disorder and menstrual cycle related exacerbation of chronic psychiatric disorders. And fourthly, depressive symptoms or depressive disorder around the time of menopause. But there's really shockingly little research on these out there on these in epidemiology. Mental health didn't feature predominantly in any of the word clouds I showed earlier. But for some examples of some cutting edge and feminist informed approaches to research in these areas, I can point you to the previous 4M seminars, including Sally King's talk on the history of and biological reductionism related to menstrual physiology and PMS. Lindsay Matthews co-produced guidelines for setting PMDD research priorities. Julie Henderson's amazing adolescent menstrual experiences and health cohort, and Martha Hickey's comprehensive overview of ways to empower women to manage the menopause. So that's a little plug. They're all on, you can get them all on our website. And very quickly, I recently took up the role as co-director of research and impact for the School of Psychology in Exeter. So I've been thinking a bit about research culture. Now I'm not an expert on this, but for what it's worth, here's my 2 pence. So I think some good practices in research culture, or at least the research culture that I would like to cultivate, could be considered feminist. Now, I'm not saying I do all of these things perfectly, but it's something that I strive to do. So part of the reason that I moved to Exeter last year was to broaden my perspective, so that in addition to working with epidemiologists and medics, I'm embedded in the psychology department, where I have more opportunities to learn from colleagues and students in a different discipline. And this is quite a humbling and scary experience on a daily, because I'm continually confronted with my own ignorance. But it's also very enriching and fun, and I feel very lucky to have the opportunity to do it. In 4M and my research group, I try to foster an inclusive, supportive, collaborative research culture. So as might be apparent, in addition to loving data, I also really enjoy collaborative research. I can't really see any point in trying to do everything on your own, or feeling any kind of strong sense of ownership over a research area. To me, it seems quite counterproductive and also quite miserable. But collaborative research is highly generative and much more fun. I try to recognize the highly hierarchical structures in academia, and try to challenge them by supporting ECRs and calling out situations in which I see people punching down. So my pet peeve is when I see a senior colleague giving really harsh criticism on a carefully crafted piece of work from an ECR, because everyone's learning, like we're all learning at every stage, and it is possible to be constructive and kind. I try to challenge patriarchal definitions of leadership, particularly by being transparent, so reflecting on and showing vulnerabilities, and hopefully empowering other people to do the same, to foster trust and empathy and growth. And I'm absolutely terrible at this, but I also try to prioritize a work-life balance. and avoid a damaging culture that's often present in academia that glorifies overwork and leads to burnout. And I might not be very good at doing it, but I at least try to foster that in the people that I support. And I hope that, I really hope that Forum does feel like an example of a feminist, or at least a positive research culture. We work really hard to provide a platform for research in this underfunded area, and to bring in the voices and expertise of non-academic stakeholders as well. So that's, I'm pretty much done. I just want to finally just throw this out to the audience if we've got any time for questions. I'd really love to take these ideas forward and to develop and apply the principles of feminist epidemiology more widely. So my question to you is anyone with me? Like, what should we do? What would be useful? Like, do we want a reading group or not? Like, how can we make our research more participatory? How can we bring in diverse voices? Has anyone got any innovative or tried and tested ideas? And what about the ideas around feminist research culture? Like, how can we develop and foster those within Forum? Yeah, or any other better ideas or better things to discuss. Yeah, thank you very much. This is just a list of people who have been great collaborators and or supporters over the years. A really special shout out to Luana, who helps lead Forum, and honestly is worth her weight in gold. And also my cat Beans, who doesn't care about menstruation or epidemiology or feminism, and she's mostly into sleeping and eating biscuits, and I would like to be a bit more like Beans. But yeah, that's it. Look forward to the discussion.
Cool, thanks, Gemma.
I just remembered that I'm also chairing it.
We've got a raised hand from Katie. There you go.
Perfect. Yeah, Kate, can you unmute? You might not have.
Hi. Sorry, I would try to start my video, but I can't. So anyway, hi. Thank you very much for your talk. I suppose one point and one question. The point is, I really liked your last slide about kind of feminist research culture, and I think probably we can say that's just good research culture. You know, that will help people who are disadvantaged in all these other intersectional ways that you mentioned, which I think probably could only strengthen our cause. You know, it's not like we're being out there not serving people. You know, it's just trying to help everybody, all backgrounds. And then kind of a question is something I've been struggling with a little bit about language. If we're talking about research to help, say, people who menstruate or people who are pregnant, you know, how we cope with the fact that these are associated with biologically female sex, but people then sometimes feel they're of a different gender. How to recognise that while also not losing the fact that there is an essence of femaleness there that we don't want to ignore. Sorry if you had any thoughts.
Thank you so much, Katie. The audio was breaking up a bit there, but I think I got the gist of what you were saying. So firstly, yes, I totally agree. I think that what I kind of termed a feminist research culture is probably just a good research culture. Like, let's do that. Maybe we don't need to call it feminist. And then the second point around language. So I guess I really wanted to make this like it's why I started with my definition of like what the definition of feminism that I'm using, which is about kind of improving the health for everybody, or the lives and health for everybody, and not just sort of focusing specifically on like cisgendered women or biological females. I'll be honest, I find it difficult. I find the language difficult because I've come under fire on Twitter either way. So if I say people who menstruate, I get some backlash, and if I say women, I get some backlash. I mean, the way that we've kind of we've discussed this before in Forum, and what we've come up with just sort of saying women and people who menstruate. But really, people who menstruate is who we're talking about a lot of the time. So I think it's evolving, and I'm just sort of following the discussion, I guess. Yeah, and any other thoughts from anyone else on how to like tackle this or address this in a kind of inclusive way? Then yeah, I'd be really happy to hear. Lindsay? Lindsay, do you have your hand up? Okay, then in that case, oh, sorry, Lindsay doesn't have a permission to unmute. Maybe just if Luana, if you, I couldn't find the option, if you could just make it so everyone can unmute and turn their videos on, that would be great. Thank you.
Hi, I've got it now. Hi,
Hi.
Gemma. Feels like ages since I've made a meeting, so it's nice to see you. And hi, Luana.
Nice to see your fake hand and name.
Yeah. I was looking forward to today because maybe like similar to one of the things you were saying was that although I'm really on board with all of this stuff, I still feel really uninformed about it. So yeah, like you're saying, it's quite humbling when you're trying to read around it, and it makes me feel a little bit, lacking in confidence about how to present some perspectives when I'm writing up papers and things like that. So I found today really, really helpful. And you had asked if anyone had any ideas about things, and without it giving you extra work, I just wondered, like, if any of us came across new papers being published, maybe we could share them and they could get tagged onto the bottom of one of the newsletters or something like that, because I don't know if everyone else is the same, but I usually just keep all your newsletters and then dip in and out of them when I need something.
Yeah. Okay, yeah, that's really useful to know, actually. We should probably do some like research on how people are engaging with 4M and like what people are doing with the newsletters and things. But yeah, I totally agree. I think sharing papers in the newsletter would be a really nice thing to do. This year we've been kind of very focused on these seminars. We're not 100% sure we'll take them forward for next year just because we've got the conference coming up and it's a lot of work, but maybe papers might be replacing or sharing research using a different route. So just that's actually a really nice idea. Yeah, and we can definitely keep these conversations going. It'd be really good to do that.
Thank you.
Maria?
Oh, yes, sorry. Now I'm muted. Just trying to unmute. Yes, Gemma, thank you so much. That was amazing. And I really appreciated hearing about what you've been doing, because you've been leading us in such a fantastic way, and it's just great to hear about what you've been up to. And I would just say that I think you are not what was it? What did you say? Yeah, you're definitely a feminist in the most like non-lay. I don't know how to put it. Yeah, because I just thought actually you've done so much to kind of embed like such a supportive and kind of open kind of group, and welcoming those who are coming from different perspectives, and I just think actually that is precisely what feminism is all about. And you outlined it really at the end. What kind of research culture should we be working towards? Yeah, I don't have any questions. I just want to know, how is the social science? I mean, I don't have super huge questions at this stage, but it's more. I do think I've really taken on board and really enjoyed reading the work that you've been doing around, the presumptions of this developmental origins of health and disease kind of perspective, partly because it's been so informative for many of my colleagues who are epidemiologists or spatial epidemiologists and geographers. And I just think actually there's probably something that I'm sure they're all, because I'm not necessarily in that space, aware of some of the things hopefully that are changing in that field. But I just think it would be great to think of a way that we could push this forward with our kind of combined efforts for perhaps transforming how epidemiological research is done, but also, when I think about, just those future possibilities. You know, what that might mean. And I guess my final comment would just be to say, yes, a reading group would be great. I would love to read more around some of the stuff that would help us kind of get some, yeah, just firm up those connecting points where I think we're all, you know, coming in from different perspectives, but probably, you know, having those shared conversations about one thing. And I will say, reading groups are great for that. That would be fun. And I think that's probably how we actually first met, maybe.
Mhm.
So.
Yeah.
So yeah, thank you so much. That was great.
Awesome. Thanks, Maria. Thanks very much, because that means a lot coming from you as well as a social scientist who does stuff on feminism. So that's really nice to hear. Yeah, and I agree. I think this might be a really nice way to take it forward, actually, is to have a kind of reading group and a way of us sharing. I think this came up in Bettina's talk as well a couple of months ago, that sometimes it's difficult to kind of digest some of the literature from different disciplines. And I've been feeling, as I've been putting together these slides, like I'm actually I feel more ignorant the more I'm learning. Because the more I'm learning, the more I'm like, oh God, there's this whole other thing. And like, there's this whole research group that just does this one thing that I thought was, yeah, just one line. But now do I need to include like a whole 10 slides on it? And and so I think it's highlighted that there's just a lot out there, and it would be really cool to speak to some kind of more informed people and share our perspectives as well. Cool. Well, we're pretty much out of time, which is so yeah, maybe we should leave it there. I'm struggling to look at the chat and follow it. So I'm sorry if people have asked really good questions in the chat and I've not picked them up. But yeah, thank you so much to everyone for coming. And yeah, as I say, like, let's keep this conversation going. And everybody have a very lovely Christmas, winter, New Year break. And we'll be back in 2024 with something, I guess, before our conference halfway through the year. Yeah, great. Thanks very much, everyone.
Thanks all. Thanks, Gemma. Bye.
Hi, everyone.
Thanks, bye-bye.